Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs. Urban planning, investment, disinvestment, and other policy choices profoundly shaped the course of events in Albany, New York. I spoke with the reporter Shayla Colon from the Albany Times Union about her series, The Two Sides of Pearl Street, which explores both the history and the contemporary implications of these decisions.
I think what he failed to see is that just because these were immigrant communities that others may have looked down on in the rest of the city, these were the homes and the businesses of many blue collar workers who were fueling your economy and fueling your city.
Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm excited to be joined today by Shayla Colon. Shayla Colon is a native New Yorker who previously worked for Hearst, Connecticut media. She now covers business news for the Times Union in Albany, New York. She's published a series of articles recently in the Times Union that collectively are entitled The Two Sides of Pearl Street. And I am excited to talk with her today about this project of hers. So welcome, Shayla.
Yeah, Rob, thank you so much for having me on today. It's a pleasure.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. I'm always excited to engage with folks from the Times Union, and especially with this kind of important, really block by block level historical work. So thank you for taking the time. I guess an opening question. You're a business journalist, right? And I'm wondering what inspired this series for you?
Sure. So when I initially moved to Albany, because I'm originally a city girl from the Bronx, I made a point to visit the downtown and just scope it out. And in doing that, I came across Pearl Street. And I was a little taken away because I frequented both North and South Pearl Street and just saw a major difference in the two ends of the street, whether it be in business, but also in the communities there. And it just intrigued me. And I thought, well, I can't ignore this. I have to explore it. What's going on here? And that led to 6 stories and about 6 months of rigorous work.
Well, it truly comes through as rigorous work. I love how the research comes through. And actually, I wanted to ask you about that. You note in the articles that there was a partnership that you took on with, I believe, the Albany Public Library. And also it's clear that you did a great deal of both contemporary and historical research here. So tell me a little bit about that background research, that rigorous work that you put into this series.
Sure. So as a journalist, you obviously know who you have to speak to from the bat. You have to talk to business development agencies, city officials. But what I wanted to do, which I thought was more important, was talk to the people that were living in these communities and get their thoughts. Because it's one thing for a public official to say something, but it's another to get the viewpoint of someone who's living evidence and experience of these changes. So initially, it's actually funny. I we were living in a pandemic, so it was hard to get in touch with people. So I thought, how can I reach people without physically seeing them? Um, and I decided to set up a Google phone number, and I printed I have hundreds, probably hundreds of flyers. And I just went along walking Pearl Street from one end to the other, passing them out and sharing them with community organizations and businesses. And it was essentially a prompt saying what the project was about, what I was looking to understand, and for people to text me at that number and share their thoughts. I'll be honest, we did not get much traction, but that's okay because just walking the street allowed me opportunities to meet people and amazing people with amazing stories. So that was how it started. But as we sort of progressed through the research of looking through historical records and talking to people who lived or live on Pearl Street, I decided to team up with the Albany Public Library System because they had recently received a grant from Google to partner with a news organization and increase their engagement with audiences. So they thought, oh, wow, you're already doing this work with the Google phone number. This would be an excellent project. And I thought, yes, please, because I want to talk to more people about this. So that's how the partnership came to be. And it has been amazing, the people that we've been able to reach as a result.
That's great. And a lot of those, the richness of your interviews certainly comes through, and I'll ask about that in a moment, as well as like the sort of the really documentary and census-based background research that you do. And it actually made me think about something. I have a lot of really brilliant undergraduates now and over the years who have not been history majors, although they've tended to be brilliant as well, but a lot of brilliant journalism majors who take multiple classes with me, and they really enjoy this kind of work. And I'm wondering, as you've taken on this project, what sort of overlaps do you see methodologically, as far as how you approach information and storytelling? What sort of overlaps do you see between your training, your calling as a journalist, and the work of a historian?
Sure. So I think something we have in common is verification. So when I interview people, it's one thing for me to have their anecdotes and understand that, but there are certain things that I can't take at face value, things that I need to provide evidence for. So like a historian, I have to go through documents and I have to do my research to independently verify that information. I think in Pearl 2, there's a great example of that. There's a woman I spoke with, Elaine Frazier, who has such a strong story about her experience in the neighborhood and how the community's demographics changed and how that impacted investment. But there are certain aspects of her story that I needed to verify with public records. And woo, for those of you who don't know, a previous mayor, Erastus Corning, had, I want to say thousands of records called the Corning Papers related to urban renewal and these cityscape changes that he was making. And I sat, it makes me laugh because there was a moment where I was having blood sugar issues and really thought I was going to pass out in the County Hall of Records. But I sat there for hours on multiple days, just digging through thousands of papers, trying to find even the smallest note that would prove what she was saying. And I found it. Weirdly, I found it. So lucky. But that would be methodically how I see the overlap between historians' work and what we do as journalists.
Oh, absolutely. That's a wonderful story. And I think any historian can sort of relate to that sort of deep dive into the archives. That's wonderful. Tell me a bit about the old days. I mean, there are references in your articles to Pearl Street and its glory days, a sort of vibrant business district. I think they refer to it as sort of the front door, right, or something to Albany. Tell me about what things would have been like decades ago.
Yes. Okay. So this is perhaps my favorite part of the project. I loved looking at the old photos and just seeing what it was previously. So in the, I would say 50s, I would say that's a good time, even earlier, Pearl Street was the city's go-to place. it had everything from large scale department stores to small mom and pop shops, restaurants, theaters. There was even one theater that it always made me laugh when I spoke to people because they would say, "Oh yeah, Leland Theater. That's where we went for the X-rated pictures." And it just had everything because you would have an X-rated theater on one side of the street, and on the other, there was one giving, or excuse me, displaying silent films. So it's just the juxtaposition's fantastic. But I almost envy those who experienced Pearl Street during that era because from the stories I've heard, it was also just a very tight knit community. Uh, it was the kind of place where you go and the bakery owner knows you, they know your order, or the vegetable man carting up and down the road would be able to tell you, hey, does your mom need more zucchinis? Are you looking for beefsteak tomatoes? And you could get it instantly. And it was just amazing.
That's great. And you've, of course, you're writing this sort of as someone who's experienced it now and saying, my goodness, what happens? And you present, I think, a thesis in one of your articles, but I think it comes through throughout the entire series. On March 31st, you had written, and I'm quoting here, that, quote, poor urban planning, coupled with racial and urban stereotypes tied to demographic changes, contributed to the transformation of a once thriving downtown artery into a bisected corridor where stark differences between its north and south ends remain. We can dig into sort of the specifics of that, but how did you, sort of to set the table, how did you come to that sort of overall conclusion? What were some of the key moments that stood out to you?
Sure. So, what initially led me to this observation was just talking to people. I spoke to people who lived in the community or on Pearl Street during the 50s and 60s, and they all said, yes, there are major demographic shifts. It was initially a neighborhood populated by mostly Irish, Italian, Polish, and German immigrants. And the reason being is because, as we mentioned, Pearl Street was a gateway to the city. So that's where a lot of people came into Albany and where they would first settle. But over time, we see that demographic shift where after urban planning decisions such as building the Empire State Plaza and the South Mall Arterial came into play, there was this, I want to say it was a phenomena of white flight.
You're setting up this sort of overall argument about how there was sort of a demographic story, and then on the other hand, there's a policy story that leads to the contemporary conditions. But actually, I'd like to dive into some of the richness of this that you just suggested. And first of all, you sort of start out with Pearl Street, as you pointed out, the sort of immigrant neighborhood. What were some of the sort of major sort of institutions or the sort of vibe of Pearl Street in its years as an immigrant community? Is that sort of a shopping district, or is it, families, churches? Like, what would it have been like at that time?
Sure. So at that time, it was a commercial district. It was chock full of retail opportunities. But what's interesting is that that's just along the Pearl Street strip. The surrounding streets were residential. They were neighborhoods.
Oh, that's great. And then, as you pointed out, the next sort of phase is the Great Migration, and African Americans, as you said, escaping the Jim Crow South. But unfortunately, as you point out later, they're not entering into a world of complete racial justice in the North either, as we're going to see momentarily. But there was a great deal of optimism at first. And there's a quote that I think is just wonderfully poignant that you include in one of the articles from the director of the African American Cultural Center on South Pearl Street, as well as he's also a prominent businessman, Trayvon Jackson. And he says this: I think when you walk along Pearl from north to south, you can read the desires of men and women who came before us by looking at the buildings. Tell me about sort of the optimism, the sort of rise of African American community along Pearl Street in the sort of the early phases when there was that moment of hope.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think Trayvon, his anecdotes were just so well put. And the African American Cultural Center is actually a terrific example because prior to becoming the center, it was a key bank. And it was transformed after all of the, I'm putting air quotes up, urban renewal in the community. Um, so, and he's absolutely right. You can see Pearl Street's history still in the buildings. If you look at the architecture and the details, it's breathtaking. I look at some of these buildings and I wonder, oh man, if we could just revive you. But the African American Cultural Center is also a good example because when all of this was taking place, and I think that people sort of need to put it in perspective too, this change in time from the 50s to the 60s and onward is also a time where there are things happening nationally. There are civil rights movements, there's a war on poverty, there's all these things taking place that also impact practices that are taking shape here in Albany. And that's exactly what happened here on Pearl Street. We saw that discriminatory practices like redlining sort of cut off people who were living in the neighborhood and investing in it at the knees from a financial perspective. They could not get loans for homes or for businesses. So they sort of had to take stock of what they had and use it. And that led to a lot of social service agencies and community groups taking hold of South Pearl Street. North Pearl Street was a little different because the scalability of the buildings permitted it to survive as a commercial district, although it did sort of go through this ebb and flow process of change.
Yeah, it was very interesting to me because in this series, we see the obvious disastrous effects of redlining on the community. And we also, it becomes very clear that disinvestment mattered and that these things, of course, obviously are very much wrapped up in race in particular. And what's interesting is a lot of that seemed to be applied to Pearl Street and the community's reputation before the big project, which of course seems to be a turning point. How much of redlining, disinvestment, and sort of institutions, politicians, the media applying disparaging cliches on the neighborhood, how much of that was going on prior to Empire State Plaza and everything we'll talk about in a moment, and how much of this almost feels like a self-fulfilling prophecy as you write this series of articles?
Sure, excuse me. So it's actually been fascinating to learn about and also a little disappointing, I'll be honest. So prior to urban renewal, or I should say what fueled urban renewal projects, depending on who you ask, was Rockefeller's desire to renovate what many deemed the gut of the city. And there's actually this incredible story about when a royal princess came to visit and he was showing her around. He took her through the South End and Pearl Street and was just incredibly embarrassed by it, which is sad because these were thriving immigrant communities with a lot to offer. But he just didn't see it that way. And so he thought, we need to fix this. We need to upend and change everything. And that's exactly what they did over the next few years.
Well, it's interesting to me because you get the sense that this and that story, it's such a sort of weird, wacky story, right? Rockefeller comes rolling in with this Dutch princess, right? And he's like, 1959. It seems as though he's missing the point, right? Is that something that's really very much revealed in the conversations you had and the research you did, that Rockefeller, this is a sort of superficial kind of hit and run assessment by this outsider who comes swooping in for an afternoon. This was still a neighborhood that was vibrant and that people, even if the government wasn't invested in it, people were invested in. This was still sort of the heyday. Is that fair? Or
From what I've gathered, I think that's true. And I think what he failed to see is that just because these were immigrant communities that others may have looked down on in the rest of the city, these were the homes and the businesses of many blue collar workers who were fueling your economy and fueling your city. And for some reason, that was overstepped.
yeah, and it's interesting because it seems as though Mayor Corning was enthusiastic about these changes as well. And if Rockefeller might have his sights on sort of grander statewide or national or international ambitions, Mayor Corning, should he have known better, or are there other motivations for him as well?
Ah, this is a great question. I don't have an opinion. Yeah, I'm a journalist,
Mhm.
but maybe he should have known better. Or maybe there should have been a little more consideration to the impact on the communities here. But also, depending on who you ask, and I'm going to emphasize that depending on who you ask, some believe that a lot of these efforts were geared toward removing Blacks from the community, and removing those blue collar immigrant families from there as well, to make room for what Elaine Fraser dubbed the white return, or not Elaine Fraser, but what some at that time dubbed the great white return.
And that was going to be driven by this remarkable modern, I think Corning calls it, it's going to be the greatest office complex or government office complex in history or something. Anytime I've ever been to Albany, anytime I've ever spoken to anyone at length about Albany history, and that's been often, that seems to be just sort of a turning point in everybody's narrative about almost everything, at least in modern Albany history. Tell me some of the immediate and then long-term impacts of the capital project and this renewal on Old Pearl Street, and then, well, we'll talk later about how it divides, but go ahead.
So immediately, you are displacing people with this construction, and you're physically cutting into the grid. So you're moving buildings, you're knocking them down. If you're public officials, you're going door to door and telling people, we're going to be taking your property by eminent domain, so you might as well sell it to us, which really forces people's hands. What are you supposed to do? But the cushion was, you have a little bit of time because it's going to take us time to develop this project. So immediately you see the displacement and the physical change to the neighborhood. And longer term, you see the community changes remain. So in creating the Empire State Plaza, you create a place for city, county, state workers to come and frequent. And you no longer have that residential base. And that's still evident today. If you talk to any business owner on North Pearl Street, they'll tell you they rely pretty heavily on state workers coming to their business and providing them a way of life. Whereas on South Pearl Street, that's been desolated. That's not even a question for them anymore. And it's because of this hulking structure smack dab in the middle of the street.
So there's a few things here. I mean, number one, there's a certain tone of understandable sadness that comes through in the interviews when you have people talking about, finding out, or when this was announced. But also, you just pointed out the physical barrier. They really just divide the street in half, right? Maybe not in half, but north-south, and it's just walkability is shot. I mean, it's just, you can't navigate anymore. Is that right?
It's interesting because I suppose it was more walkable prior to the South Mall Arterial cutting through the street. But for me, I find it still walkable. I come from the city though, so it's a little different for me. And I can find myself walking. This is exactly what I did. I would park my car either by the North Pearl Street by McGreary's and the Hollow. And I would walk all the way down to the very end of South Pearl Street and back. But I think people, when they consider walkability, they're thinking of it in terms of businesses and where you can go and hang out. So that's where walkability is disrupted.
No, absolutely. I know it's regrettably with the pandemic, it's been a long time since I've been in Albany, but I know I've walked through that the stretch that you've described multiple times, and it's not so much that you can't do it; it's that there's in between there's kind of nothing for a long time, and sort of terrifyingly giant structures. So I understand that very much. Now that leads to a sort of contemporary. This is, I suppose, a minor point, but I think it reveals important elements. There's contemporary debate as to the real dividing line between North and South Pearl, and I guess it has to do with those structures. But tell me a bit about the official and then the sort of cultural divide.
Mm-hmm. So the official demarcation line, according to grid planning, is State Street, and that divides North and South Pearl Street. But if you ask people who live or work on Pearl Street, they'll give you a whole host of different answers. Some will tell you it's Market Street, some will tell you it's Morton. And the reason being is because that's not geographically where the streets sort of end and pick up, but rather that's where you see a shift in, like you said, this psychological and culture shift. And I think that's true, because on State Street, you still have this very small bit of commercial retail with what was previously the Times Union Center. It's now the MVP Arena, and a couple of large-scale buildings. But right at Market Street is where the South Mall Arterial cuts through. And once you walk past that, once you get to about Madison Avenue and South Pearl Street, drastically different. There are not many stores, whereas on North Pearl Street, you have plenty of restaurants, an axe throwing place, clothing shops, banks, office spaces. That's not the case on South Pearl Street. Rather, you have, I would say, I'm actually trying to count right now off the top of my head. I can recall 2 restaurants, Pearl Fried Chicken, and then further down by the Board of Elections is the South Pearl Street Cafe. And in between that, there's just a lot of vacant buildings. There are a few of some, I want to say they're like stucco designed brownstones. So they're very small. And that's just apartments, excuse me, as well as just bodegas, convenience stores, and discount stores. But it's mostly vacant buildings that take up the street. And as people have described, there's a change, and I'm putting air quotes up again, in the element on the 2 ends of the street. Whereas, like we said earlier, North Pearl Street's heavily frequented by city, state, and county workers. South Pearl Street's more so of a neighborhood feel, where you have local residents going in and out of, example, Pearl Fried Chicken. But you also have this stream of homeless individuals because of the Capital City Rescue Mission, which is situated on South Pearl Street, that has affected a lot of people's outlooks and a lot of people's ability to conduct business the way they want on South Pearl Street. To say that the issue of the Capital City Rescue Mission's proposal for an expansion is a hot topic would be perhaps the understatement of the year here in Albany. The issue is essentially the location. However, it's important to note the rescue mission has been there for decades, and they've been serving the community there for a while. So there's a map in the 3rd story of the installment, in the installments, that shows you where the rescue mission is situated. So it's situated about, I want to say it's less than a block. It's maybe a couple hundred feet away from an elementary school. And further up the street is a police department. There's also the Board of Elections across the street from it. And where people tend to take issue with it is how the population that it serves affects the everyday lives of people living on Pearl Street, specifically children who go to school every day and have to see individuals maybe doing some unsavory things right out front. And it concerns them. And there have been incidents as well. The most recent, an attempted abduction that people believe is linked to a client of the mission, but police did not confirm. And I mean, I'll be honest, in walking Pearl Street, it doesn't faze me much because I'm pretty used to it, but I can understand where it would make people uncomfortable, where you see individuals maybe drinking alcohol, or there was one day I was walking right along the mission. I was actually headed to talk to one of the bodega owners across the street. And in a matter of about 20 minutes, 2 fights broke out. So I can understand where people would maybe feel uncomfortable, but as the executive director of the mission pointed out, they are there to serve people. And I think the general sentiment is that they understand that. They just are looking to maybe rein in some of the unsavory things they see. And the mission has contended that the expansion would allow them to do so by giving them more space to create daytime activity rooms for individuals, so they're not outside as much. Yeah, so it's definitely an interesting subject, and I think people are just waiting to see what the city will say about it. And there's a lot of back and forth regarding the matter.
It's interesting. You were speaking a moment ago about, when you walk along from north to south, the North Pearl Street area from the 70s and 80s on, you point out in one of the pieces, was getting a little bit of reinvestment, right? And this comes from the historical buildings. It comes from, as you pointed out, the proximity to all of those government workers and all of those sort of white collar clientele that are coming in, commuting in every day. And it almost sounds like for North Pearl Street, much of the vision that they had hoped of this sort of revitalizing, whatever that meant to them, coded as it may have been, kind of happened. And South Pearl Street, it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like it was almost a throwaway to the policymakers. There wasn't a real vision. They didn't care too much. And we're seeing the results in both North and South. Is that fair, or how's the history playing out before our eyes, in other words?
Mm-hmm. So several people that I've spoken to often relay the feeling that South Pearl Street was left behind and forgotten by investors and the city. And a lot of it, like we said, is due to the scalability of buildings there. So investment on North Pearl Street was more fruitful just because they had the space to do things like reintroduce retail and commercial spaces. But South Pearl Street the groups there and the community there have really fought to introduce investment, but they've had a harder time because of, as business owners point out, things like the mission's clientele or just the buildings. And some would think, which this will come out in a later story this week, that a lot of the buildings on South Pearl Street remain vacant and unused because owners are perhaps waiting for something bigger to come in, bigger than perhaps a community group, and would provide them more profit or better revenue. And North Pearl Street, it's interesting because I would say even just about 10 years ago, if you looked at North Pearl Street, it wasn't where it was today. And a large part of that is because of investment made by people like Jeff Buell at Redburn Development or Chris Pratt, who owns the Steuben Street Market on North Pearl. They invested in the buildings, they renovated them, and they made them what they are today. But if you ask them as well, they're also struggling because it's one thing to have those restaurants and bars and commercial offerings, but if you don't have the people to frequent them, it's almost as if, what is it for? So what they're trying to do now is introduce more housing to the street. And actually, some office spaces may be converted into apartments because now they need to provide the density for that market.
So it almost sounds like it's a decades-long process of almost reversing the trends that had been instigated in this, I guess, in the 60s. Is that's interesting?
It is, and as Trayvon pointed out previously, you had the people to frequent the street, but now you have, and it's not the entire street, but you have a large part of the street that is amenable and usable, but you don't have the people to come take care of it and come do what they need there.
Yeah. So you obviously, it's come through here, and it certainly is richly detailed in the articles. You've spoken to many people in the community, contemporary business owners, in spite of their, as you point out, their initial reticence. You've had a lot of conversations, and you've noted here and in the pieces diverse perspectives on Pearl Street. What are some of the views, maybe the diverse or even divergent views of Pearl Street in 2022, and where they are, what they need, etc.?
Sure. So this is another favorite part for me. So as the stories have been publishing, we have gotten a number of people responding and sharing their thoughts via the Hearken platform that we set up with the public library. And it's amazing. I get such a diverse set of viewpoints. Sometimes people will say, yeah, North Pearl Street is where it's at. South Pearl Street needs some more work. Or they'll say the opposite. They'll say South Pearl Street has more of a residential neighborhood, so it should be invested in more. But what's interesting is a common thread I'm hearing from these lovely, optimistic people is that they want to see Pearl Street partly become what it once was and be restored to its former glory days as a commercial district. But there are also opposing views that say, no, Pearl Street cannot return to what it once was because it's different today. And so you need to capitalize on the assets there that are there, such as the residential base on South Pearl Street. And you need to tailor services to come to them. And that's a large part of what you'll hear people say is that the essentials people living there need are not present. Gas stations, grocery stores, even a little bit of retail is still missing. So until you amend that, how can you possibly continue to grow it without first providing the essentials?
Wonderful. I would ask, as you have been working on this series, and we're speaking sort of in the middle of the series, it's not all out yet. Has anything along the way sort of surprised you, or has anything even sort of informed you, either just based on somebody who is a reporter studying and reporting about Albany as a resident of Albany, or just as a journalist, sort of methodologically or philosophically? Has there anything jumped out at you, or have any lessons come through here?
Sure. Something that, how do I say this delicately? Something that has surprised me and I think perhaps should be remedied is the fact that the city's mayor did not want to speak to me for this project. And I thought her viewpoint was incredibly important to talk about the communities there and how she can help them grow or how they plan to help them grow. So, bit of a letdown.
I was going to ask about that, but I wasn't sure if I would get us in trouble. So yeah, I was just, so Mayor Sheehan didn't want to talk, but the county executive did talk, right? Is that how it went, or? So this is sort of frustrating, I guess. Oh.
Yes. No, it's okay. I'm a journalist, so I'll be 100% transparent with you. It was frustrating because you essentially take ownership of this city. You're this city's leader. So your viewpoint, like I said, is just incredibly important. And to not want to speak about something like this, it says a lot to the people living there, because I'm sure I've actually heard people say, yeah, I'm not surprised that she doesn't want to speak about this, but she really should chime in.
Well, so there's one takeaway as a reporter in Albany. I guess the other thing I wanted to ask, if you're willing to share, what are some of the topics that subscribers or those who run to one of those bodegas and grab the next Times Union, what are we going to be reading about coming soon in this series?
Sure. So I will say there are about 2 stories left in this series, but there is room for more depending on what people want. So in Pearl 5 and 6, we really talk about the difference in physical investments between the two ends of the street, and also what projects are underway and what people are hoping to see come to fruition in the future. And what I mean by there being more wiggle room for more is, actually, here's an example. This week, I'm putting together a roundup of questions that people propose through the Harkin platform. An example would be, why is Pearl Street named Pearl Street? So I'm compiling some quick, short answers for people. So I'm listening, and I want you to get the answers that you're seeking. And if any more questions come in that we feel could really spawn another story, then we're willing to do that.
Great. Are you allowed to tell us how Pearl Street got its name, or do we have to wait for the next?
I would say wait. I'm still doing my research because there are a couple of theories.
All right. Well, we will hold on for that. But I am so grateful, Shayla, that you joined us today, and for your really diligent, often historically based, but also through a lot of rich interviews, wonderful journalism, and the excellent storytelling along the way. So I'm grateful for both your journalism and for your time today. And thank you for joining us on Empire State Engagements.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rob.